The Darkening Age, The Christian Destruction of the Classical World by Chatherine Nixey. This is a preview on a really recommended book written by Chatherine Nixey on the rise of Christianity and the destruction of the classical world. These first 10% can be read and acquired free from the Kindle edition on Amazon.com. And since they are the free preview, I allow myself to read from this free preview as a sort of advertising for the book, so I hope it interests you. Prologue. Palmyra, 385 AD. The destroyers came out of the desert. Palmyra must have been expecting them. For years, marauding bands of bearded, black-robed zealots, armed with little more than stones, iron bars, and an iron sense of righteousness, had been terrorizing the east of the Roman Empire. Their attacks were primitive, thuggish, and very effective. These men moved in packs, later in swarms, as many as 500. And when they descended, utter destruction followed. The targets were the temples, and the attacks could be astonishingly swift. Great stone columns that had stood for centuries collapsed in an afternoon. Statues that had stood for half a millennium had their faces mutilated in a moment. Temples that had seen the rise of the Roman Empire fell in a single day. This was violent work, but it was by no means solemn. The zealot roared with laughter as they smashed the evil, idolatrous statues. The faithful jeered as they tore down temple, stripped roof, and defaced tombs. Chants appeared, immortalizing these glorious moments. Those shameful things, sang the pilgrims proudly, the demons and idols, our God's Saviour trampled down altogether. Zealotry rarely makes for good poetry. In this atmosphere, Palmyra's Temple of Athena was an obvious target. The handsome building was an unapologetic celebration of all the believers loathed, a monumental rebuke to monotheism. Go through its great doors, and it would have taken your eyes a moment after the brightness of a Syrian sun to adjust to the cool gloom within. As they did, you might have noticed that the air was heavy with the smoky tan of incense, or perhaps that was a little light there that came from a scatter of lamp left by the faithful. Look up, under flickering glow you would have seen the great figure of Athena herself. The handsome, haughty profile of the statue might be far from Athena's native essence, but it was instantly recognizable with its straight Grecian nose, its translucent marble skin, and the plump, slightly sulky mouth. The statue's size, it was far taller than any man, might also have impressed. Though perhaps even more admirable than the physical scale was the scale of the imperial infrastructure and ambition that had brought this object here. The statue echoed others that stood on the Athenian Acropolis well over 1,000 miles away. This particular version had been made in a workshop hundreds of miles from Palmyra, then transported here at considerable difficulty and expense to create a little island of Greco-Roman culture by the sands of the Syrian desert. Did they notice this, the destroyers, as they entered? Were they even fleetingly impressed by the sophistication of an empire that could quarry, sculpt, and then transport marble over such vast distances? Did they even for a moment admire the skill that could have been kissably soft-looking mouths out of hard marble? Did they even for a second wonder at its beauty? It seems not, because when the men entered the temple they took a weapon and smashed the back of Athena's head with a single blow so hard that it decapitated the goddess. The head fell to the floor, slicing off that nose, crushing the once smooth cheeks. Athena's eyes, untouched, looked out over the now disfigured face. Mere decapitation wasn't enough. More blows fell, scalping Athena, striking the helmet from the goddess's head, smashing it into pieces. Further blows followed. The statue fell from its pedestal, then the arms and the shoulders were chopped off. The body was left on its front in the dirt. The nearby altar was sliced off just above its base. Only then does it seem that these men, these Christians, felt satisfied that their work was done. They melted out once again into the desert. Behind them the temple fell silent. The votive lamps, no longer tended, went out. On the floor the head of Athena slowly started to be covered by the sands of a Syrian desert. The triumph of Christianity had begun. Unending. Athens, 532 AD. There must have been a melancholy party. In AD 532, a band of 7 men set out from Athens, taking with them little but works of philosophy. All were members of what once had been the most famous Greece's philosophical schools, the Academy. The Academy's philosophers proudly traced their history back to an unbroken line, a golden chain as they called it, to Plato himself, almost 1,000 years before. Now, the chain was about to be broken in the most dramatic way possible. These men were abandoning not just their school, but the Roman Empire itself. Athens, the city that had seen the birth of Western philosophy, was now no longer a place for philosophers. Their leader, Damascius, must have been some comfort to them as they set out on this trip into the unknown. By the standards of the time, he was old, elderly even, almost 70 when their journey began. But he was formidable. Damascius was a brilliant, densely subtle thinker who prepped his writings with mathematical similes, and he did not suffer fools gladly. The acerbic "Who is who" he wrote on his fellow philosophers is full of crushing comments on anyone whose intelligence or courage he considered wanting. In life he could be as immoderate as in his writings. He had once almost drowned in a river when, too impatient for a boatman to take him across, he had decided to swim instead and nearly had been swept away. Many of Damascius' great risks were run in the service of his beloved philosophy. He had already sheltered a wanted philosopher in his own home, embarked on perilous 1,000-mile journeys to the unknown, and braved the risk of torture and arrest himself. No man, he felt, should do any less. Men tend to bestow the name of virtue on a life of inactivity, he once wrote with scorn. But I do not agree. The learned, who sit in their corner and philosophize at length in a grand manner about justice and moderation, utterly disgrace himself if they are compelled to take some action. There was no time for a philosopher to be philosophical. The tyrant, as the philosophers put it, was in charge and had many alarming habits. In Damascius' own time, houses were entered and searched for books and objects deemed unacceptable. If any were found, they would be removed and burned in triumph bonfires in town squares. Discussion of religious matters in public had been branded as damnable audacity and forbidden by law. Anyone who made sacrifices to the old god could, by the law said, be executed. Across the empire, ancient and beautiful temples had been attacked, the roofs stripped, their treasures melted down, their statues smashed. To ensure that the rules were kept, the government started to employ spies, official and informers, to report back to what went on in the streets and marketplaces of cities and behind closed doors and in private homes. As one influential Christian speaker put it, in his congregation should hunt down sinners and drive them onto the way of salvation as relentlessly as the hunter pursues his prey into nets. The consequences of deviation from these rules could be severe, and philosophy had become a dangerous pursuit. The master's own brother had been arrested and tortured to make him reveal the name of other philosophers, but had, as Damascus recorded with pride, received in silence and with fortitude the many blows of the rod that landed on his back. Others in Damascus' circle of philosophers had been tortured, hung up by the wrists until they gave away the name of their fellow scholars. A few philosophers had, some years before, been flayed alive. Another had been beaten before a judge until the blood flowed down his back. The savage tyrant was Christianity. From almost the first years that a Christian emperor had ruled in Rome in AD 312, libraries had begun to be eroded. And then, in AD 529, the final blow had fallen. It was decreed that all those who labored under the insanity of paganism, in other words, Damascus and his fellow philosophers, would be no longer allowed to teach. There was worse. It was also announced that anyone who had not yet been baptized was to come forward and make themselves known as the holy churches immediately or face exile. And if anyone allowed themselves to be baptized and slipped back into their old pagan ways, they would be executed. For Damascus and his fellow philosophers, this was the end. They could not worship their old gods. They could not earn any money. Above all, they could now not teach philosophy. For a while they remained in Athens and tried to eke out a living, and in AD 532 they finally realized they could not. They had heard that in the East there was a king who was himself a great philosopher. They decided they would go there despite the risks of such a journey. The Academy, the greatest and most famous school in the ancient worlds, perhaps ever, a school that could trace its history back for almost a millennium, closed. It is impossible to imagine how painful the journey through Athens would have been. As they went, they would have walked through the same streets and squares as their heroes, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, had once walked and worked and argued. They would have seen in them 1,000 reminders of those celebrated times were gone. The temples of Athens were closed and crumbling, and many of the brilliant statues that had once stood in them had been defaced and removed. Even the Acropolis had not escaped. Its great statue of Athena had been torn down. Much of Damascus' writing has been lost, but occasional phrases remain, certainly enough to discern his feelings. His entire life, he wrote, was being swept away by the torrent. The writings of another Greek author from some years earlier show similar despair. We are, he wrote, man reduced to ashes, for today everything is turned upside down. In another bleak epigram, this same anguished poet asked, is it not true that we are dead and only seem to live, we Greeks, or are we alive and life is dead? When modern historians describe this period, this time when all the old religions died away and Christianity finally became preeminent, they tend to call it the triumph of Christianity. It is worth remembering, however, the original Roman meaning of the word triumph. A true Roman triumph wasn't merely about the victory of the winner. It was about the total and utter subjugation of the loser. In a true Roman triumph, the losing side was paraded to the capital, while the winning side looked on at an enemy whose soldiers had been slain, whose possessions had been despoiled, and whose leader had been humiliated. A triumph was not merely a victory, it was an annihilation. Little of what is covered in this book is well known outside of academic circles. Certainly, it was not well known by me when I grew up in Wales, the daughter of a former nun and a former monk. My childhood was, as you might expect, a fairly religious one. We went to church every Sunday, said grace before meals, and I said my prayers, or at any rate the list of requests which I considered to be the same thing, every night. When Catholic relatives arrived, we play-acted not films, but First Holy Communion and, at times, an actual communion. A terrible sin, and not a wonderful game either, this was at least an opportunity to glean extra blackcurrant juice from adults. So there was a lot of God, and at any rate of Catholicism in my childhood. But despite having spent a combined 26 years inside monastic walls, my parents' faith was never dogmatic. If I asked about the origins of the world, I was more likely to be told about the Big Bang than about Genesis. If I asked where humans came from, I would have been told about evolution rather than Adam. I don't remember as a child ever questioning that God existed, but equally as a teenager I remember being fairly confident that he did not. What faith I had died, and my parents either didn't notice or didn't mind. I suspect that somewhere between monastery and world, their faith had died too. What never ever died in our family, however, was my parents' faith in the educative power of the church. As children, both had been taught by monks and nuns, and as a monk and a nun, they both had taught. They believed as an article of faith that the church that had enlightened their mind was what had enlightened, in distant history, the world of Europe. It was the church, they told me, that had kept alive the Latin and Greek of the classic world and the benighted Middle Ages until it could be picked up again by the wider world in Renaissance. On holidays, we would visit museums and libraries where the same point was made. As a young child, I looked at the glowing gold of the illuminated manuscript and believed in a more metaphorical illumination in ages of intellectual darkness. And in a way, my parents were right to believe this, for it is true. Monasteries did preserve a lot of classical knowledge. But it is far from the whole truth. In fact, this appealing narrative has almost entirely obscured its earlier, less glorious story. For before it preserved, the church destroyed. In a spasm of destruction never seen before, and one that appalled many non-Christians watching it, during the 4th and 5th centuries the Christian church demolished, vandalized and melted down a simply staggering quantity of art. Classical statues were knocked from their plinths, defaced, defiled and torn limb from limb. Temples were razed to their foundations and burned to the ground. A temple widely considered to be the most magnificent of the entire empire was levelled. Many of the Parthenon sculptures were attacked, faces were mutilated, hands and limbs were hacked off, and gods were decapitated. Some of the finest statues of the whole building were almost certainly smashed off, then ground into rubble, and that was what used the churches, and then was used to build churches. Books, which often were stored in temples, suffered terribly. The remains of the greatest library of the ancient world, a library that had once held perhaps 700,000 volumes, were destroyed in this way by Christians. It was over a millennium before any other library would even come close to its holdings. Works by censored philosophers were forbidden, and bonfire blazed across the empires as outlawed books went up in flames. Dramatic though all this was, far more destruction was achieved through sheer neglect. In their silent copying houses the monks preserved much, but they lost far more. The atmosphere could be viciously hostile to non-Christian authors. In the silence in which monks worked, gestures were used to request certain books. Outstretched palms undermined turnings of pages signified that the monk wished a psalter to be passed over to him, and so on. Pagan books were requested by making a gagging gesture. Unsurprisingly, the works of these despised authors suffered. At a time in which parchment was scarce, many ancient writers were simply erased, scrubbed away so that the pages could be reused for more elevated themes. Palimpsests, manuscript in which one manuscript has been scaped again, provide glimpses to the moments of which these ancient works vanished. The last copies of Cicero's De Republica was written over by Augustine on the Psalms. A biographical work by Seneca disappeared beneath yet another Old Testament. A codex of Sallust's history was scrubbed away to make more room for Saint Jerome. Other ancient texts were lost through ignorance. Despised and ignored, over the years they simply crumbled into dust, food for bookworms, but not for thought. The works of Democritus, one of the greatest Greek philosophers and the father of atomic theory, was entirely lost. Only 1% of Latin literature survived the century. 99% was lost. One can achieve a great deal by the blunt weapons of indifference and sheer stupidity. The violent assaults of this period were not to preserve the cranks and eccentrics. Again, attacks against the monuments of the mad, the damnable, and the insane pagans were encouraged and led by men at the very heart of the Catholic Church. The great St. Augustine himself declared to a congregation in Carthage that all superstitions of pagans and heathens should be annihilated is what God wants, God commands, God proclaims. Saint Martin, still one of the most popular French saints, rampaged across the Gaulish countryside, leveling temples and dismaying locals as he went. In Egypt, Saint Theophilus razed down one of the most beautiful buildings of the ancient world. In Italy, Saint Benedict overturned the shrine to Apollo. In Syria, ruthless bands of monks terrorized the countryside, smashing down statues, tearing off the roofs of temples. The attack did not stop on culture. Everything from the foods on one plate, which should be plain and certainly not involve spices, through to what one got up in the bed, which likewise, plain and unspicy, began for the first time to come under the control of religion. Male homosexuality was outlawed, hair plucking was despised, as too were makeup, music, suggestive dancing, rich food, purple bedsheet, silk clothes, the list went on. Achieving this was no simple matter. With the omniscient God had no trouble seeing not only into men's hearts but into their homes, Christian priests had a little more difficulty in doing the same. A solution was found. St. John Chrysostom encouraged his congregations to spy on each other. Each enter others' homes, he said. Pry into each other's affairs. Shun those who don't comply. Then report all sinners to him, and he would punish them accordingly. And if you didn't report, then he would punish you too. Just as hunters chase wild animals, not from one direction but from everywhere, and cast them into the net, so too together let's chase those who've become wild animals and cast them immediately into the net of salvation, we from this side, you from that. Fervent Christians went into people's houses and searched for books, statues, and paintings that were considered demonic. This kind of obsessive attention was not cruelty. On the contrary, to restrain, to attack, to compel, even to beat a sinner was, if you turned them back to the path of righteousness, to save them. As Augustine, the master of the pious paradox, put it, "O merciful savagery!" The results of all this were shocking and, to non-Christians, terrifying. Townspeople rushed to watch the international famous temples were destroyed. Intellectuals looked on in despair as volumes of supposed unchristian books, often in reality texts on the liberal arts, went up in flames. Art lovers watched in horror as some of the greatest sculptures of the Asian world were smashed by people too stupid to appreciate them, and certainly too stupid to recreate them. The Christian could often not even destroy effectively. Many statues on the many temples were saved simply by virtue of being too high for them, with their primitive ladders and hammers to reach. I had originally conceived on this book as a travelogue. It would be interesting, I thought, to follow Damascus as he zigzagged across the Mediterranean, a pagan St. Paul, Syria, Damascus, Baghdad, parts of Egypt, and the southern border of Turkey. All places that he had travelled to were by no means easy to reach, but they were just about achievable. However, in the years between coming up with the idea and writing this book, the reality of doing so became impossible. Since then, as I write, the Syrian civil war has left parts of Syria under the control of a new Islamic caliphate. In 2014, within certain areas of Syria, music was banned and books were burned. The British Foreign Office advised against all travel to the north of the Sinai Peninsula. In 2015, Islamic State militants started bulldozing the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud, just north of Mosul in Iraq, because it was idolatrous. Images went around the world showing Islamic militants toppling statues around 3 millennia old from their plinths, then taking two hammers to them. False idols must be destroyed. In Palmyra, the remnants of the great statue of Athena that had been carefully repaired by archaeologists was attacked yet again. Once again, Athena was beheaded. Once again, her arms were sheared off.